Welcome to the How My Parents Raised Me podcast, Mark and Lynetta. You are the Soulmate Coaches, and you're helping people to clear their past relationship hurts so that they can find their soulmate. There are so many humans totally unconscious to the trauma they hold from childhood. And of course, that trauma comes along with us into our relationships. And with half of marriages failing, it's definitely very important work that you're both doing. You both experienced trauma in your own childhoods that has affected your past relationships. Lynetta, can you tell me about the dynamic between you and your mum and dad? What was that like growing up?
Well, with my mom, she was a stay-at-home mom, and I remember her doing a lot of cooking and cleaning and sewing. She sewed all our clothes and she liked to make matching dresses. But I found out that as I grew up later that really I was her little doll. She had me to try to fill a void within herself. And she wanted me to be her little, be with her for the rest of her life. Like she would, as I was growing up, she would say, I want our family to live together, like Dallas and Dynasty. Do you remember those shows?
Yeah.
Where all the kids lived together? That was her dream. And I would recoil at that idea. I'm like, no, I'm not living with you forever, She wanted to keep me protected in this religion that she didn't want me to associate with anybody outside of our church. And so it was very strict, and I was confined just to associate with those in that it was Jehovah's Witness. So it was very strict, and I never had my own, was allowed to have my own views. I was always told what to believe. And then with my father, he was a violent man, so he would have these he would break out into a rage. His eyes would go black, and he wouldn't even remember what had happened. So he had trauma from his childhood that was unresolved, and his anger and rage unleashed on us kids at times, and you never knew when it was coming. So I was I had high emotional intelligence, and I would watch for his gestures to see if he was angry, if he started walking really hard. I could hear him come down the hallway to my room, and if I heard these stomping feet, my whole body would just tremble with fear. I remember him coming in the middle of the night when I woke up from a nightmare and I'm crying, and he would come hold his hand over my mouth and my nose so tightly I could not breathe, and I thought I was going to suffocate. And I couldn't tell him that I couldn't breathe, but I don't think he was conscious of what he was doing totally. He just had such a hot temper that he would get triggered by my crying, and then he would come in and just try to silence me. So I disassociated and learned how to, then my body would just go limp, and then he would stop doing that. So my fight, flight, or freeze was, survival mechanisms were full in force. I was always on alert, and I could tell if anybody in the room was getting upset or angry, and I was hyper vigilant about anybody having an upset, because I never knew how far it was going to go. So that affected me later on in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's terrifying, isn't it? For a little kid to, first of all, you're not allowed to express any emotion, and when you do cry out, somebody literally physically silences you. It's that's a massive trauma for a little girl to deal with. How did that play out as an adult? What sort of coping mechanisms or what sort of things were you turning to?
I was terrified at night. That was mostly the most terrifying time. So I would need a man to be in bed with me, and I wasn't very selective. I usually chose through my 20s and my 30s, I chose men that were mirroring my parents. It felt like home.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, it feels like you're home. Well, my home life was just like that. It was chaotic. It was, so I, although I could sleep at night because they were laying next to me, but the daytime was a nightmare living with them. So I'm attracting unhealthy people, toxic people in my life, and yet needing to have that body next to me, because if there was somebody right next to me, I could just calm, like my whole body would calm down, and I felt safe. And I usually wanted to choose these big buff guys, that they're protectors, that's what it looked like, and later on I found out, oh, that's because I thought that they'd protect me, but they weren't men that loved themselves, and they had trauma in their background, so it actually wasn't safe to be with them either. So it kept me in that cycle, which is what happens when you have, multi-generational trauma. Is it keeps getting passed on, and you attract partners who also will pass on that, and then you have children and you pass it on down to them. So, the cycle keeps going until you finally come to, this has to stop. And I came to my knees, and it had to come to a stop.
Yeah. And was there some homelessness in your story?
Yes. I actually lived for a while. My boyfriend, we kind of lived out of his truck, and when we'd go down to the river and pitch a tent, and there was an area where you could, they had like gold mining. If you staked a claim, you could live there, so we had a tent there, but we had to pack everything up every day and move, and he'd go to work, and then he'd drop me off in town, and I would go to a public bathroom and wash up in the sink, and just hang out in town for a while until he got off work, and then we would sometimes we would sneak into the office of the people he worked for, and we'd sleep on the floor in the office. And then later on, years ago, I was like in my 30s. I also lived on the streets, and I was a heroin addict. So I was doing heroin, cocaine for about 3 years, because the man I was with was an addict, and I really wanted to be with him, so I'm like, I have to use the drug he's using to be with him. So we were living out of the car, and he would go to prison every few months, and then I'd be stuck by myself living out of my car. I went to jail through that for 60 days, went to a 30-day rehab, and got out and started going to 12-step recovery meetings.
Wow, that's a lot, isn't it?
And
so you got yourself through those times. At what point did you sort of realize that you needed to change things for yourself?
Well, I think this is in my book, the story of when I'm in jail and my son comes. He's like 6 years old, and he comes to visit me with my mom, and it's behind glass, and there's a phone that you have to pick up, and he says, well, Mom, why don't you just walk around and come home with us? And I said, I can't. I'm locked up in here. He hung up the phone and wouldn't speak to me for the rest of the time. He was so angry. And I went back to my bunk crying, and I saw his picture because he had mailed me a drawing that he had, that he loves me and all that. And I just bawled my eyes out, and I said, this is enough. I'm not going to hang out with men like this anymore, because all it's going to do is I'm going to end up in jail.